The land rolled on forever, a hard sweep of desert and grass cut by shallow draws and scattered mesquite. Calder Boone rode it the way other men walked through their own backyards. His gelding's hooves struck a steady rhythm, and the only company was the wind sliding across the prairie. He liked the quiet. Quiet didn't argue or betray. It left him to his cattle, his work, and the wide, lonesome country he had chosen after the war. Men called him a drifter, but Boone had put down stakes on a patch of land no bigger than what he could manage with his own two hands. It was enough that this day, though, something broke the pattern. In a shallow wash, half hidden by mesquite, a freight wagon stood tilted against a dead tree. Canvas sagged in strips, the wheels sunk deep into sand. Crows lifted at his approach, dark wings cutting the pale sky. Boone pulled rein. Abandoned wagons were nothing new, but this one was too fresh. He could see where the team had been cut. Loose, tracks sharp in the dust. A man didn't leave freight like that unless something had gone bad. He swung down, leading his horse closer. The boards bore fresh gouges, as if someone had fought to get free. Boone pushed the canvas aside. The shadowed interior smelled of rust and dust. At first, he saw only broken crates. Then came the faintest sound, soft as a breath that didn't want to be heard. He stilled. It came again. Boone stepped inside. In the corner, chained to the wagon's ribs, was a woman. Her wrists were bound in iron, her dress torn, her face pale beneath streaks of dirt. Eyes wide and wary met his, holding more fight than her body could show. For a moment he just stood there. Then he pulled his knife. She flinched back, but Boone spoke low. "Easy, not for you, for the chain." The shackle pin had been driven hard, but rust weakened it. Boone twisted and wrenched until the iron gave way. The chain fell, clattering on the floorboards. She sagged forward, too weak to hold herself up. Boone caught her, surprised by how light she was, little more than bone and grit. "Why?" The word rasped out of her throat. He met her eyes. Because no one ought to be left this way. That was all. She seemed to believe it, because her eyes softened, then closed. Boone eased her down onto a blanket, but she was already gone to exhaustion. He looked at the broken chains, at the wagon abandoned in silence. Men had done this. Debt, greed, cruelty, he'd seen all of it before. It never sat right, and it wasn't going to now. He lifted her carefully, carried her out into the cold sun, and settled her across his saddle. His horse sidestepped, but Boone steadied it with a hand. Mounting up, he felt the weight of her saddle against him. It was light, yet it anchored him more than all the miles behind. The wagon shrank in the distance as he rode on, but Boone knew the trouble tied to it was far from finished. She had been left to die in chains. Whoever did that would want her. Back, the prairie stretched ahead, endless and silent. Boone urged the gelding forward. For the first time in years, he wasn't riding alone. The trail home stretched long and empty, dust rising behind Boone's gelding in fading light. He kept his arm firm around the woman, steadying her against the rhythm of the ride. She never stirred, though once he felt her shiver, as if caught between fever and cold. By nightfall, his ranch came into view, a low cabin built of hand-hewn logs, a lean-to stable, and a corral holding what cattle he could afford. No grand spread, no hired men. Just Boone and the land, holding each other together. He swung down at the hitch rail, shifting her weight gently into his arms. The dogs came bounding out, hackles bristled until they caught his voice. He carried her inside, where the cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee grounds, and laid her on his own bunk. Her wrists were raw where the iron had bitten. Boone lit the lamp and poured water into a tin basin, washing away blood and dirt. She stirred then, eyes half opening, catching his face in the lamplight. "You're safe here," he told her. She tried to speak, but the words broke against a parched throat. Boone lifted a cup, tilted water to her lips. She drank like someone who hadn't seen a drop in days. When she eased back, her breathing was steadier. "Name's Calder Boone," he said. "This here's my place. You'll rest here until you've got your strength back." Her voice was ragged. They said I was dead." Boone's jaw tightened. He'd heard of it men taking women, even children, to pay off what they claimed was owed. Ugly business, common enough on the fringes where law walked slow. "They won't claim you here," Boone said. Something in his voice made her believe, because she let her eyes close again. Boone sat back, elbows on his knees, staring into the shadows. He fixed her a thin broth, spooning it to her when she could manage. Her name, he learned, was Mary Ellen. She'd been bound in that wagon 3 days, left when the men quarreled and scattered. They meant to haul her east, sell her off. On paper they claimed was lawful. Boone said little while she told it. He listened, filing each word into the ledger he kept in his mind. There would be a reckoning. The storm rolled in near midnight, wind howling down off the ridge. Boone stoked the fire, laid another quilt across her, and checked the latch on the door. Outside, sleet rattled the shutters, but the cabin stood firm. At dawn, he was out splitting kindling when he saw horsemen far across the flats. 3, maybe 4, dark shapes against the gray horizon. He knew the kind. Collectors. Boone's hand tightened on the axe handle. They'd come for her. The law might let it pass, but his land, his roof, and his word would not. He carried in the wood, stacked it by the fire, and glanced toward the bunk. Mary Ellen slept, her face softer now, no longer the mask of despair he'd first seen. Boone set the axe against the wall. Trouble was coming, and he'd face it the way he faced all things square on, with no thought of backing down. The storm broke by mid-morning, leaving the world washed in gray light and the smell of wet earth. Boone saddled his gelding and rode the fence line, eyes sharp for breaks. The land always came first. A man didn't eat unless his cattle held together, but as he rode, he kept glancing east where he'd seen riders the day before. By noon, they arrived. 4 of them, riding hard and straight, dust and mud streaked across their coats. Boone watched from the porch, arms folded, as they reined up in front of his cabin. The lead man swung down, boots striking the ground heavy as iron. He carried himself with the weight of paper in his pocket and a pistol on his hip. "Name's Rigsby," he said, slicking the rain off his hat. "We've come for the woman. She's debt property, sold legal. We've the papers to prove it." Boone said nothing at first. Silence was a weapon of its own, one he'd learned on the trail and in war. Let a man talk too much, and he showed what he feared. Finally, Boone drawled, "That so? Papers don't mean much out here. What I found was a woman left chained in a wagon. Looked more like a crime than a sale. Rigsby's smile was thin. "You don't want trouble, mister. Hand her over, and we'll be on our way." Boone's eyes never moved from his. "She's inside. She's under my roof. That means she's not yours." A stir went through the men. Hands twitched near holsters. Boone felt the weight of his Colt at his side, but he didn't move. He wasn't looking for a fight. Not yet. But if one came, it would be finished quick. Rigsby shifted, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "This here's signed by Judge Harper in Las Cruces. Makes her legal tender for dead owed. She was sold fair." Boone glanced at the paper, but didn't touch it. Funny thing about fairness. Don't look much like it when a woman's shackled. In iron. Rigsby's eyes narrowed. "I'll give you till tomorrow. Then we come back, and she rides with us. One way or another." He shoved the paper back in his pocket, jerked his reins, and the men wheeled their horses. Boone watched them ride off, a dark knot settling in his gut. Tomorrow. That gave him one night. Inside, Mary Ellen sat by the fire, pale but upright, a quilt wrapped tight around her shoulders. She had heard every word. "They'll kill you," she whispered. Boone poured coffee into a tin cup, set it in her hands. "Maybe, but they won't take you." Her eyes glistened in the firelight, searching. His face. "Why risk it? You don't even know me." Boone leaned on the mantel, staring at the flames. "Don't need to. A man's worth something only if he stands where right is. That's enough." Outside, the wind had stilled. The prairie lay quiet, but it was the kind of quiet before a storm, one made not of weather but of men. Boone knew come morning, lead would likely fly, and he knew where he'd be standing when it did. The wind came first, a low growl sweeping down from the mountains, bending mesquite and stirring the dust. Calder Boone smelled it in the air, rain mixed with the bitter tang of lightning. He'd seen storms break cattle herds before, scatter them across miles of range. If he lost his stock tonight, there'd be no getting back on his feet. He was tightening the barn doors when Mary Ellen appeared at the threshold, quilt thrown around her shoulders. Her eyes were wide, catching the flicker of lightning on the horizon. "You should stay inside," Boone told her. "I can work," she said simply. Her voice was still weak, but there was steel in it. Boone gave a curt nod. This wasn't a night for argument. Together, they hurried through the corral as the first sheets of rain swept across the flats, cold and stinging. The cattle bawled, hooves pounding mud as they pressed against the rails. Boone shouted above the wind, driving them toward the shelter of the barn. Thunder cracked like a cannon overhead, and the gelding reared in his stall. Then the barn door shuddered. Boone turned just as the ridge beam groaned under the weight of wind and rain. "Get back," he bellowed, but the words were lost in the storm's roar. With a splintering crack, one side of the barn wall gave way, boards flying like matchsticks. The roof sagged, threatening to crush the cattle trapped inside. Boone lunged for a support post, bracing his shoulder against it, straining to hold it upright. Mary Ellen. The cattle pushed them out. She didn't hesitate. Barefoot in the mud, she grabbed a switch and drove at the panicked herd, shouting hoarsely, forcing them toward the gap. Calves bawled, mothers shoved forward, hooves striking sparks on stone as they surged into the rain. The roof groaned lower. Boone felt the timber slipping under his weight. His muscles screamed, but he held on, giving the cattle time to escape. Go. He barked at her. Get clear. She turned, saw him straining against the beam, and shook her head. Instead, she darted to his side, jamming a broken fence rail under the sagging crossbeam, wedging it against the ground. The makeshift brace caught, giving Boone just enough relief to shove himself clear as the roof gave way. The barn crashed down in a storm of dust and splinters. The gelding screamed, but Boone was already moving, ripping planks aside, hauling the animal free before the wreckage settled. Mud streaked his face, blood ran from a cut on his temple, but the horse stood trembling, alive. Mary Ellen leaned against the corral rail, soaked through, hair plastered to her face. Her chest heaved with each breath, but her eyes were steady. On him. You should have run, Boone told her, and left you. She shot back, voice raw. Not after what you did for me. They stood in the rain, the storm still raging around them, cattle bawling in the dark. Something passed between them then, stronger than words. Forged in sweat and danger, Boone pulled the gelding close, stroking its wet flank. He looked at her again, rain dripping from his hat brim. She was no longer just a burden he'd found. Chained in a wagon, she was a fighter. Someone who stood when others would run, and Boone knew, deep down, that changed everything. Morning broke sharp and cold, the kind that cut a man's lungs when he drew breath. Boone hitched the wagon, the team stamping restless in the traces. Mary Ellen stood nearby, wrapped in his old trail coat, her face pale but resolute. They'll be waiting, she said. Boone adjusted the reins. All the more reason to meet him head on. There's a judge in town, and if those men claim papers, let's see what law has to say. The ride into Las Cruces was long, the wagon rattling over frozen ruts. Town. Came into view false fronts, a church steeple, smoke curling from chimneys. Folks on the boardwalks paused as Boone reined in before the courthouse. Word traveled fast in places like this, and already eyes followed the woman beside him. Inside, the courtroom smelled of dust and ink. Judge Mercer Harper sat high on the bench, a man with silver in his beard and the weight of the territory on his shoulders. His gavel struck once. Case of property in dispute. Rigsby versus Boone. His eyes lifted. Proceed. Rigsby swaggered forward, papers in hand. Your Honor, we hold signed indenture for one Mary Ellen Kearney, traded lawful in settlement of debt. We claim her rightful return. He slapped the papers on the clerk's desk. His men stood at the back, hands hovering too close to iron. Boone stepped forward. I found her chained in a wagon, left to die. No debt justifies that. The judge peered down at Boone, then at the woman. Madam, is this true? Mary Ellen stood, shoulders trembling but voice steady. They chained me like cattle. I never agreed. They said I was payment for my father's debts, but I signed nothing. I never gave consent. A murmur swept the room. The judge held up a hand for silence, leafing through the papers. His brow furrowed. Indenture requires voluntary signature. These documents bear only her father's mark. Boone spoke again, his tone flat as the desert horizon. A woman ain't property. Not here. Not while I draw a breath. Rigsby bristled. She is ours, and Boone's got no claim. The judge's gavel cracked down, loud as a pistol. Enough, these papers are void. Debt cannot bind another's life without consent. This court declares Mary Ellen Kearney free." The room erupted, some with gasps, others with muttered curses. Rigsby's face darkened. His hand dipped toward his pistol, but Boone was already moving. His Colt cleared leather smooth as a thought, barrel leveled steady. "Best think twice," Boone said, voice quiet but carrying through the room. Judge just gave his ruling. "You draw, and I'll bury you where you stand." For a long, heavy moment, nobody breathed. Then Rigsby's hand eased away from the pistol grip. He spat on the floorboards. "This ain't finished." Boone didn't. Lower his gun until the men backed out the doors, spurs clattering down the boardwalk. Only then did he holster the Colt. Mary Ellen swayed, relief breaking her strength, and Boone caught her elbow. The judge leaned forward, eyes softer now. "She's free, Boone. What she does next is her choice." Boone looked at her, then back at the judge. "I'll make it plain, Your Honor. She have a place on my ranch if she wants it. More than that, if she allow it." Mary Ellen's gaze lifted to his. Rain still clung to her memory, storm and wreckage, but here in the courthouse she found something stronger than survival. She nodded once, slow but sure. The judge's gavel came down again. Then so be it. The ride back from town was quieter than the road in. The dust of trouble still hung in the air, but the worst of it had passed. Boone drove the wagon steady, the leather creaking in his hands. Beside him, Mary Ellen sat wrapped in his old trail coat, watching the land roll by as if seeing it for the first time. When they reached the ranch, the dogs came bounding to meet them, tails wagging, and the cattle bawled from the far pasture. Boone stepped down, lifted her gently to the ground. For a moment she lingered, eyes sweeping across the low cabin, the barn's broken frame, the corral mended with fresh rails. "It's not much," Boone said, almost apologetic. Her voice was soft but certain. "It's more than I've had in a long time." Inside, he set a kettle on the stove, poured coffee thick as tar into tin cups. She cradled hers, warming her hands, staring into the fire. Finally, she spoke. "You meant it." Back in the courthouse. "About staying." Boone leaned against the mantel, hat in hand. "A man alone can do the work of two, but it's a hard life. A woman deserves more than mending fences and fighting storms. But if you choose to stay, there'll be a place here. A home, and more, if you'll have it." She looked up, eyes catching the firelight. "You mean as your wife?" Boone nodded once, not out of pity, not out of debt, but because I reckon we could build something together, a family, a life worth more than drifting. Mary Ellen's lips trembled, but not from fear. She set down the cup and folded her hands in her lap. "I've been owned, Boone, sold like stock, but never asked. You're the first to give me a choice. That matters." Silence hung between them, filled with the crackle of the fire and the low hum of the prairie wind against the shutters. Then she said, almost whispering, "Yes, I'll stay." Boone's jaw tightened, not from doubt but from the weight of the moment. He reached out, rough hand closing gently around hers. No more words were needed. Days slipped into weeks. The wrecked barn was cleared, new beams raised with Mary Ellen handing him tools, steady and sure. Her laughter quiet at first, then freer echoed through the cabin. She learned the rhythm of the place, milking before dawn, cooking meals that filled the rooms with warmth, and then came the gain. Children Boone had taken in 2 strays from the trail, a brother and sister left orphaned when fever swept through a wagon train. They'd lived under his roof before, eating at his table, but never had a woman's hand to guide them. Mary Ellen changed that. She braided the girl's hair, patched the boys' shirts, and set bread cooling on the WINDOWS. Evening, as the sun dipped red over the ridge, Boone heard the girl's small voice carry across the yard. She tugged at Mary Ellen's skirt, eyes bright, and said, "Ma?" The word hung in the air like a bell struck clean. Mary Ellen froze, then knelt, drawing the child into her arms. Tears slid silently down her cheeks as the boy followed, clutching. Her hand dot from the porch, Boone watched, a lump rising in his throat. He'd seen gunfights, storms, and death on every horizon, but this moment struck deeper than any bullet. Mary Ellen wasn't just staying. She belonged, and in that belonging, the ranch ceased to be a lonely man's refuge. It was a family's home. Spring came restless that year, the kind that carried both promise and trouble on the wind. Boone was out mending a line fence when young Tom, the orphan boy, came running from the far end of the pasture, fists clutching something folded and brittle. "Found this, Mr. Boone," the boy said. "Back in the wreck of the freight wagon." Boone wiped sweat from his brow, took the paper. The edges were curled, ink faded but legible. At first he thought it was another debt note, but then his jaw hardened. Across the top, in ornate script, were the words, "Certificate of Marriage." The name struck like a hammer. Mary Ellen Kearney. Wedded by contract to one Samuel Rigsby. Signed and sealed in a territorial clerk's hand. Boone folded it slow, eyes narrowing at the horizon. This was no ordinary sale. They'd bound her under the guise of marriage without her consent, with the stroke of a pen. That night, by the fire, he set the paper on the table between them. Mary Ellen stared at it, hands trembling. "I never saw it," she whispered. "My father signed me away while I was still a girl. They told me later I was already wed, though no vows were spoken, no church, no witness I chose, just ink." Her eyes lifted to his, fear flickering there. "Boone, if that paper stands, it means I'm bound to him." Boone's face was carved from stone. "Paper don't make a marriage. A woman's word does, and yours was never given." "But the law can be twisted," Boone cut in, his voice flat. "But I'll see it set right. You're not his. You're not any man's unless you choose to be. Tomorrow we ride to town. That judge will hear it." The next morning they hitched the wagon again. The children rode in back, wide-eyed, clutching the sideboards. Folks turned to watch as Boone drove up to the courthouse, Mary Ellen sitting straight despite the weight of what lay ahead. Inside, Judge Harper eyed the document Boone placed on his desk. His frown deepened as he read. "This is troubling." Rigsby was there, of course. He rose from the benches, smugness twisting his face. "There it is, plain as day, Your Honor. She's my wife by law. Boone's harboring another man's spouse. That makes him guilty of theft and worse." Boone's hand twitched near his Colt, but he held steady, eyes fixed on the judge. Mary Ellen stepped forward, voice trembling but clear. "I never gave my vow. I never stood before preacher nor judge. My father sold me like stock, and this man forged the rest. The room buzzed. The judge raised his gavel for quiet. The law recognizes no marriage without free consent. What's written here is fraud, null and void, Rigsby sputtered. You can't. The gavel cracked down, sharp as thunder. I can, and I have. Boone reached for the paper, held it high for all to see. Then, with slow deliberation, he tore it down the middle. The sound echoed through the room like gunfire. He dropped the pieces to the floor, where they fluttered. Like dead leaves, Mary Ellen's breath caught. Boone met her eyes across the silence. You're free, and that's the end of it. The judge nodded once, final, so ordered. Rigsby's hand hovered near his gun, but one look at Boone's steady gaze made him think better of it. He shoved through the doors, muttering curses that carried into the street. Mary Ellen stood taller, shoulders squaring as if a great weight had been cut from her. Boone felt something shift in that moment to something permanent. This wasn't just about shelter anymore. It was about a life rebuilt, clean of chains and lies. The tearing of that false marriage paper carried further than the courthouse walls. By the time Boone and Mary Ellen rolled back onto the prairie, every saloon and feed store in Las Cruces was buzzing. Some said Boone had made himself an enemy of Rigsby's outfit. Others said he'd stood where any decent man should. Life on the ranch moved steady, but Boone felt eyes on him when he rode into town for supplies. At the mercantile, old Mrs. Talbot offered Mary Ellen a bolt of cloth and a smile that said more than words. At the blacksmith's, Hank Dorsey spat in the dust and muttered, "Boone done right," loud enough for others to hear, but not all were kindly. A knot of men outside the saloon stared too long, and Boone caught the gleam of recognition, Rigsby's allies, men who fed off scraps of power and weren't quick to forget insult. He ignored them, but his hand never strayed far from his Colt. Back at the ranch, Mary Ellen worked with quiet purpose. She mended clothes, baked bread, and kept the children close. At dusk, she walked the fence-a-line with Boone, her skirts brushing the tall grass. Once she stopped, gazing over the spread bathed in golden light. "This land of yours," she said. "It feels like it could be mine too, if you'd have it that way." Boone studied her, the way she carried herself, no longer the frail shadow he'd cut loose from chains, but a woman standing square on her own feet. "It's ours," he said simply, "if you want it." The children sealed it without knowing. They clung to her skirts, called her Ma, as if they'd always known. The word, Boone heard it one evening, and it hit him harder than any storm. Family, something he'd thought lost to war and wandering, was alive again under his roof. Still, shadows stretched long. One night, as Boone and Mary Ellen sat by the hearth, the dogs bristled at the door. Boone rose, Colt in hand, but it was only Sheriff McCall, lantern held high. "Boone," the sheriff said, stepping inside, "word is Rigsby's gathering men. He took that paper tearing as blood insult. Might come calling." Boone nodded. "I figured as much." The sheriff's eyes went to Mary Ellen. "You've a right to stay safe. If you'd rather, the church'll give you shelter till this cools." Mary Ellen shook her head, chin high. "I won't hide. This is my home now." Boone's chest swelled at her words, though he kept his face calm. The sheriff tipped his hat. "Then keep your rifle close. Trouble's a mean dog best to meet it." At the door, after he left, Boone stood a long while at the window, watching the night stretch across the plains. Mary Ellen came beside him, her hand brushing his. "If they come, we'll face it together." Boone turned, met her gaze. In her eyes he saw not fear, but the steady fire of someone who had been broken and rebuilt herself stronger. He nodded. "Once, together then." Outside, coyotes called to the moon, and in the distance a rider's silhouette crested a ridge before fading into darkness. Boone knew the quiet wouldn't last. Rigsby wasn't finished. But neither was he, and this time he wasn't standing alone. The prairie wore its quiet like a mask, but Boone had lived long enough to know silence was often the loudest warning. The dogs paced restless near the porch, ears pricked to the east. Mary Ellen rose early, stoking the fire, her eyes steady. Though she felt the weight of the air, same as he did by dawn, Boone saw them, dark specks on the horizon, growing larger with each heartbeat. Riders, 6 this time. Rigsby at their head, stiff in the saddle, a man burning on pride and hate. Boone tightened his gun belt and stepped onto the porch. Mary Ellen appeared behind him, a rifle in her hands, the boy and girl peeking wide-eyed from the doorway. Boone gave her a look, but she met it square. "I can shoot," she said, "and I won't run." The riders drew up in a half circle, dust curling around their horses' hooves. Rigsby spat into the dirt. "Boone, you tore up law and made me a fool. Now you'll pay. Step aside, give me the woman, and maybe I'll leave you breathing." Boone's voice was iron calm. "You had your say in court. Judge stripped your claim. She's free. You come here now. It ain't law you bring, it's blood." One of Rigsby's men barked a laugh. "Then blood it is." His hand darted. For his Colt, Boone moved like lightning, his own gun flashing from leather, the shot cracking across the yard. The man toppled sideways out of the saddle, dust rising where he fell. The others froze, eyes wide. Boone's arm stayed steady, the Colt leveled, smoke curling from the barrel. Rigsby's face twisted. Kill him, but men aren't quick to die for another's pride. They hesitated, shifting uneasy in the saddle, waiting for someone else to make the first move. Boone's eyes swept them cold. First man to draw joins his friend in the dirt. The stillness held, thick as molasses. Horses stamped, breath snorting in the cool morning air. Boone felt Mary Ellen at his shoulder, rifle cocked. He knew if they rushed him, he wouldn't stand alone. Rigsby's hand twitched near his holster, but he saw something in Boone's gaze that stopped him cold, a look born on battlefields. In men who had already stared down death and didn't flinch. Slowly, one of the riders turned his horse, then another. The knot began to break apart, men drifting back the way they'd come. Rigsby cursed them, spittle flying, but no one stayed at his side. "You'll regret this, Boone." He roared, face purple with rage. "This ain't the end." Boone's reply was quiet, sharp as a blade. "It's the end for you, if you ever ride back here." Rigsby glared a long moment, then jerked his reins and galloped after the others, dust trailing him into the horizon. The yard fell still again, save for the hammer of Boone's heartbeat in his chest. He holstered his Colt, turned to Mary Ellen. She lowered the rifle, breath unsteady but eyes alight. The children burst from the doorway, clinging to her skirts. Boone laid a hand on her shoulder. "You stood tall. he said. Her chin lifted. You gave me something worth standing for. The storm had passed, but Boone knew its mark would last. He'd faced Rigsby's guns and come out whole, but more than that, he'd found the shape of a life that wasn't lonely anymore. The prairie has a way of healing itself after storms. Grass bends, then rises again. Tracks in the dirt fade under wind and rain. Boone found life wasn't much different. Weeks passed since Rigsby had ridden off with curses in his throat. Word drifted back through town. His outfit had scattered, men gone to Mexico or taken to rustling cattle too far south to matter. Boone didn't waste thought on them. A man like Rigsby was already beaten the moment his own riders turned their backs. At the ranch, work filled the days mending fence, driving cattle, raising a new barn stronger than the last. Boone set the beams, Mary Ellen steadied the ladder, and the boy fetched nails from a bucket. The girl hummed while she swept the floor clean of splinters. It wasn't fast work, but it was theirs. One evening, as the sun bled over the horizon and coyotes sang from the draws, Boone sat on the porch rail. Mary Ellen stepped out beside him, a shawl over her shoulders, her hair shining in the last of the light. Barn's near finished, she said. Boone nodded. Oughta hold through any storm now. She was quiet a moment, then turned to him. So will we. He looked at her, at the children playing in the yard, their laughter carrying over the prairie. Something tightened in his chest, not from loneliness anymore, but from the fullness of it all. He'd been a man drifting on trails, a soldier without a cause. Now he had roots deeper than fence posts, stronger than cedar beams. Inside, the children argued playfully over chores. One called again, "Ma," and Mary Ellen's face softened. She slipped her hand into Boone's, and for the first time since he'd built the cabin, it didn't feel empty. Not long after, the preacher rode out from town. The vows were spoken by lamplight, the children standing proud at Mary Ellen's side. When Boone said, "I do," it was plain and steady. Like the man himself, no flourish, just truth. That night, after the preacher left, Boone walked the pasture under a sky burning with stars. He thought of the freight wagon half buried in the draw, of the broken chains that had once held a woman's wrists. He thought of tearing that false marriage paper in half, of facing down Rigsby at dawn with only courage and a steady hand. He'd lived long enough to know a man can't always choose what trails cross his own, but he could choose what he stood for when the time came. And from that choice, a family had grown. Back at the cabin, the lamplight spilled through the window, warm against the dark. Boone stepped inside, where Mary Ellen was tucking the children into bed. Their laughter faded to whispers, then silence, and the little house settled into peace. He sat by the hearth, boots stretched toward the fire. Mary Ellen joined him, leaning into his shoulder. They said nothing, because nothing needed saying. Outside, the wind moved gentle across the land, carrying the promise of tomorrow. The prairie would remember storms and gunfire, but it would also remember this: a lonely rancher who found a woman chained in a wagon, cut her free, and gave her a name, a home, and a family. And in that, a new story was written on the land, one made of grit, redemption, and the quiet strength of love. And so, from a freight wagon half buried in the desert dust, a new life was born. What began with chains and despair ended with freedom, justice, and the quiet triumph of love. Calder Boone, once a man alone on the plains, found more than a partner. That day he found a family, a reason to stay rooted in the land he had worked with his own hands. Mary Ellen, once sold and forgotten, rose again with strength no paper or man could take away. Together they raised children who called her Ma, built a ranch that weathered storm and fire, and carved a place in the territory's memory. Folks still tell it in hushed voices, that a drifter found a woman bound in iron, cut her loose, and stood against every lie and gun to keep her free. A tale not of outlaws or gold, but of something stronger, decency, courage, and a love that could not be bought nor broken. And in the wide sweep of the frontier, where storms come fast and men pass into legend, their story became more than survival, it became history. If this story touched your heart, thank you for staying with us to the end. Share it with someone who believes in second chances. Leave a comment. Your thoughts keep these stories alive. And if you'd like more true to the frontier tales of love, courage, and redemption, subscribe and join us on the trail. No pressure. Just stories worth remembering.